Gentlemen, be seated. Gentlemen, let me introduce Cliff Hardy and his experienced wife, Barbara, who's handling all the technical stuff. Cliff is going to give us a talk, among other things, about the Blitz. November 1936 in England. Lived in London during the German Blitz and rocket attacks. At the age of 14, he left the usual school system and attended the London Nautical School. Joined the Merchant Navy at 18 as a deck apprentice. He has presented to Probus, View, Rotary, Day Clubs and Servicemen's Clubs and other senior organisations. His range of talks, he's got 5 talks, he's only giving one today. He's given it to 216 clubs all over Victoria, parts of New South Wales and on a cruise ship. Cliff Hardy, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much indeed for that marvellous introduction. Well, I gave it my best. But thank you nevertheless for the invitation to speak to you. The subject selected is, how can I say, most people who've been experienced war seldom like to speak about it. I'm no exception. I didn't have a get up with a gun and shooting war, but nevertheless we consider ourselves frontline participators in World War II, both Barbara and I. So without more ado, it might catch up with me, although it was 80 years ago, it does occasionally catch up on me. My mother was a 28-year-old housewife when my father, 29, was called up for army service on the 8th of August 1940. I was an only child, you can tell how spoiled I am, by that time aged 4. We were living in what you would call a commission group of flats called Pointers Gardens, number 202, in Clapham, Southwest 4, London. Dad was a fully qualified plumber, and on being taken into the army, in their weird way, shall we say, he was taken into the Pioneer Corps, who were considered to be the labourers, not a fully qualified plumber, the labouring corps. They kept him for a month, and then they transferred him to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. They kept him for a year and transferred him yet again to the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME. They in turn attached him to the 5th Guards Division, an armoured group. This is where I think I've got the twist on this army intelligence business. Dad was a plumber. The 5th Armoured were a tank corps. Well, of course, plumbers service tanks. I've got no idea what he did during that time. He never ever spoke about his experiences. He did come back home eventually a different man. He suffered very, very badly from migraines, and he was dosed up by his doctor on what are now considered illegal drugs. He stayed with the 5th Guards Division for the whole of his service remaining for 4 years. Most guardsmen are 6 foot tall by tradition. Dad was 5'6". He landed with the 5th Guards on Jig Beach in France, and he went through France, Belgium, Holland and Germany. I only remember seeing him twice during the whole of his service. He came home on leave, complete with rifle, tin hat, and all the rest of his clobber that he was issued. He was finally demobbed on the 24th of March, 1946. A grateful nation gave him a cardboard suitcase and a suit made by the government. Get back to work, pick your shoes up, and pick yourself up and get back to work again. He resumed his plumbing activities with the council, earning £3 5 per week less tax. By the time he was back with us, I was then 10 years of age. Now we'll leave that out of it for a while and we'll go back to these commission flats where we live. This slide here shows the black sections are the actual blocks of flats, most of them 5 balconies in height. The white on the inside here are the internal roadways on the estate, and the green is where the gardens used to be. I say used for a reason as I'll come to. At the start, 39 was when the first bombs were dropped. Prior to that, there was a phony war going on in Europe. Lots of talks taking place trying to prevent Herr Hitler from taking over the rest of Europe. During that time, eventually the British government realised that it was going to get serious. So they started issuing blackout material for people to make blinds to cover their windows. They installed sirens in every area, and on the first occasion they tested the sirens, knowing that war was sort of imminent. They didn't tell anybody. So there was mass panic, talk of surrender and all sorts of things when the sirens were going. They built shelters for people, shelters to protect them from the expected bombing. Those that were on public estates, such as ours, were built by the council builders. Those that were for civilian use, people had to dig into their back gardens and erect the shelters themselves. They also began rationing of foodstuffs. At the start of the war, England was importing 20 million tonnes of food per year. They issued identity cards. Very simple affairs compared with what we would expect today. Again, back to the flats where we lived. This is the block that I lived in. It ended just round the corner here, and it ended here. And then another block, a bit of a gap, and then another block started. This was the flat that we lived in. Ground floor, first floor, second floor, third floor. The only access to all these flats was by means of a single staircase, which was barely wide enough for 2 adults to pass each other without touching. I leave you to imagine what it would be like when all outside lights are banned, including torches that you might carry, and in the middle of the night there's an air raid and you have to quit your home, make your way down these stairs, across the yard and into one of the greened areas where the shelters were erected for the use of occupants there. It wasn't an easy business. How people weren't killed in the panic that sometimes happened is beyond me. Next one. Also, in preparation for the war, knowing that gas had been widely used during the First World War, the population of the whole of England were issued with gas masks. This one here is the one issued for children. It was called, to keep it all jolly and happy, a Mickey Mouse gas mask. It was far from that as far as I was concerned. 4 years of age, had to go to a council depot to have these things fitted. It was slid over my face. It smelled very strongly of French chalk and rubber. And then they pushed it on, the straps onto the top of my head. Then they started to tighten up the straps, and the mask was then gripping all around my face. They checked to see that I was still breathing by looking through my peepholes. And then to ensure that the gas mask was sufficiently tight and would stop any gas penetrating, the fitter put his hand over the air intake, and the mask just grabbed firmly onto the whole of my face. I screamed like hell until they took the damn thing off. Unfortunately, we never ever had to wear the gas mask again. You had to carry them around with you for the first couple of years of the war, but fortunately gas was never ever used. Adults had similar, only they're all black, and they didn't have the jolly little nose tongue to waggle around at the front. Next one. The identity card. It's a bit of a laugh nowadays. You could reproduce this on your home computer very easily. Next one. The only personal aspect of it was your signature. You had to carry that with you at all times. You could be stopped by any serviceman or police officer and your identity card demanded. Failure to produce would be arrest. The idea being that if Germany used paratroopers and they dropped into England somewhere, a policeman could approach him and say, identity card. If he failed to produce his identity card, having searched through his rifle and everything else, he would get arrested, I don't think. Example of a ration book. Practically, by the end of the war, everything you had brought into the home was rationed. The only exception being fresh air. An example of a petrol rationing book. I picked this up last time I was in the UK when my mother was alive. She still had it among her paperwork. I don't know how we came across having a petrol rationing book, because we had no petrol engines whatsoever in our family, nor was there a likelihood of ever having them. My mother, being the type of woman she was, she didn't sell it on the black market. She could have made many, many pounds through selling it, but here it is in perfect new condition, as it were. Next one. That's an example of the sort of shelter the civilians with private homes had to build. All very well. The government provided the steel sheeting, the empty sandbags. You dug the hole, you pushed the earth to one side, eventually filling the sandbags. You erected the steel part of the shelter, put the earth on top, in the sandbags, and there you were, ready for the first air raid. Being in England, however, what invariably happened was the siren went off, you dived into your shelter and started swimming. They filled up with water very, very quickly. Next one. That, however, is the type of shelter, not the exact one, the type of shelter that the council built for our flats and the shelters that we were allocated for use. There was no seating provided, no heating, no ventilation in case of a gas attack. There were 3 light bulbs suspended from the ceiling, no water, no heating, as I've already said, and no sanitation. We would be in there for an air raid which could extend anything from an hour to about 2, maybe 3 hours before the all clear sounded and you could leave the shelter. Now, bearing in mind that most of the people occupying the shelter were elderly. All the younger people had been commandeered into the Army, Air Force, Navy, etc. And also young wives and children. You reckon nobody'd want to go toilet in this exciting situation? Some genius took the fire buckets off the wall, emptied the sand out, and the first unisex toilet ever invented was put to use. Eventually, somebody brought in some sacking and they created a screen so that there was some degree of privacy. Who emptied them at the end of an air raid? I got no idea. Whoever did deserved a medal. It meant them having to take this smelly thing out, take it to their home, empty it down the toilet, assuming the toilet was still working, and then bring it back for the next air raid. Some people entertained. Other than that, that's how it was. You brought your own blankets, etc., etc. We used this type of shelter. My mother and I, when the siren sounded, we made our way down to the shelter. We laid on the floor. Mum managed to bring a blanket with her. She had no other rellies in the area, so only what she could carry, which included me, down to the shelter. And there we stayed for the next 2 to 3 hours, as required by the government. Unfortunately, part of the air raid included the severance of sewage pipes, electricity, gas, telephone. All the services could be severed by a bomb dropping in the area. Consequently, it used to be a big joke here in Australia. English people rarely got to bathe. Indeed, they were lucky to get a wash in some occasions. Consequently, disease in this sort of shelter was common. If one person had a cold, by the end of the week, everybody had a cold, and worse. My mother and I caught body lice, which my mother was absolutely shocked to the bone about. Only dirty people get body lice, but we caught it from other people in the shelter, had no options. We had to report to a council depot for clearing. Males this way, females that way. I was greeted by a green giant in a green overall, green mask, green welly boots, who marched me into a room. Take your clothes off. I was about 5-ish by that time. It was a little bit difficult, but I stripped, and she hosed me down with a cold water hose, and then took my clothes away. Came back, painted me all over in a sort of a lime wash in every crescent or crevice, and left me to dry, which was quite nice, because as it dried it sort of got a bit harder and itchy. And then she went off and collected my clothes, brought them back, hosed me down again, gave me my clothes, which were all hot, they'd been baked in an oven, and said, get dressed. I did as I was told, eventually made my way out of the room to be greeted by Mum, who'd been through exactly the same process, and she stood me up and said, you do not ever tell any of our relatives, neighbours or anybody else about our experience here. We are not dirty people. She'd be horrified of me till I've told hundreds of people now in this sort of situation, but it was extremely embarrassing for people in that, well, you can imagine these days as well. We didn't have a car. In those days, only bank managers and doctors had cars. They could have a car that was any colour they liked, so long as it was black. And because of the petrol situation, most of the cars around were converted to run on gas. Domestic gas and some other sort of gas, and I'm no engineer, I don't know. They had, in the boot of some of the cars, they had a little furnace sort of thing, which had charcoal connected to it, somehow or other, and the gas was fed up into this bag, and then in turn down to the engine. And that somehow made the engine work without using petrol. The bombing. Now I'm going to talk about not just bombing, which was about maybe a dozen German aircraft coming over anywhere and dropping some bombs. This was a method of bombing that Hitler developed during the Spanish Civil War. He sent over an air force to aid Franco in winning his part of the war, the Condor Group. The Condor Group developed a bombing method whereby every aircraft available was employed in bombing one city. Every single bomb they could carry, one city, bang, the whole lot. He called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. They developed it even further during Europe, and they came over to render this sort of service to England. I'm talking about Blitzkrieg, mass bomber formations concentrating on one particular town or area. Whilst all this was going on, there was still single aircraft and half-dozen aircraft coming over to bomb maybe an aerodrome or a factory or something like that. This was mass bombing intent on killing people, flattening houses, stopping the normal business functions, etc., in the city. This was one of the first bombs that were dropped nearby where we lived. This is Balham High Road, where we did all of our shopping. In those days, no supermarkets. We did have a department store, that's this one, this one, this one. They were all the same store, but at the beginning of the war, the outside blinds came down, steel blinds, and they never went up again. We didn't know at the time, but the government had converted this department store into a factory producing bomb sites for our own bombers. I got a feeling Germany knew about it. Otherwise, why drop a bomb on a shopping centre? Next one. Same scene, different side of the road. Now, during the rationing, you had to register with a dairy in order to draw your butter, cheese, etc., etc. And the same applied butchers, shops, greengroceries, grocers, etc., etc., etc. And you had to register with that particular shop, and if they had enough room on their register, they would take you on as a customer. Otherwise, go away, we don't have enough stock issued by the government, and you're not on our register, so we can't serve you. Imagine then at the end of an air raid, you go get some butter, you're not going to get it from your regular registered shop. You have to find you another supplier in the area, hopefully not too far away, because you have to walk most of the way. Talking of walking, that bus and any other traffic using the high street is not going to be serviceable for quite some time until that hole is at least filled in. Also, every pipe that you see, fractured, unusable. There is no supply in the area until those services have been rendered fit. So you may well spend time in the shelter, come up dying for a cup of tea, get home, there's no water, there's no electricity. Go to the toilet, you can't flush. So those sorts of things were common around the areas where the bombing occurred. All street signs were removed. Anything, the name on this building here indicates an area, that would be removed in order that paratroopers and other people who are not welcome wouldn't find out where they were, without that sign indicating they hadn't a clue where they were. So all street signs were removed. Temporary shelters were built in large intersections so that any police, fire brigade, ambulance, anybody who's caught out in the open could duck into these temporary sort of shelters. Anti-aircraft guns, amongst other things, were installed within the City of London, the greatest city of London. The only open spaces were parks and commons. And this is an example. This is Clapham Common. The gun people dug big holes and made places to store their ammunition, and they were there to fire at the fleets of bombers that came over from Germany to bomb London into submission. However, the government made a couple of small mistakes. These guns, yes, fired upon the bombers overhead in the hope of hitting some, but what the government forgot was what goes up must come down. The shells exploded, chunks of metal, white hot metal, about the size of my fist, were created, hopefully to hit the bombers, but if they didn't hit the bomber, or if they did and just went through it, they came down to earth. In the heavily densely populated areas of London, with the houses been there for some of them for hundreds of years, close together, the white hot metal came down, broke through the tiles and created more fires in the attic areas of more houses than almost all the bombs did that the Germans dropped. Next one. The underground, London's famous underground. Deep below the ground, a very good service was run by the trains, coming along, dropping people off at the stations who left the station by means of electric lifts or electric escalators. People decided that, hey, these would be safer than our shelter, or they'd get caught out in the open on the way to work or whatever. So they decided to make this their shelter. They lay down, sometimes went to sleep, on the platform. The government said, you cannot do that. The civilian population put two polite fingers up to the government and did it. Eventually the government relented and they installed steel bunks on every platform in most of the tube stations, which was fine. They're much safer. But on at least 2 occasions that I'm aware of. Unluckily, a bomb went straight down the air conditioning inlet, straight down to the lower sections of the station, exploded, and of course knocked out all the electrics of the area, broke all the pipes passing through the station, sewage, water, etc. And a lot of people who weren't killed by the bomb's explosion drowned in sewage and water. The staff were very, very good. They waded through almost neck-high water and guided people who were still able to out of the station. They wouldn't have got out by themselves because they wouldn't have known where the ordinary staircases were and other exits from the station. So I'm talking about the bombing. The first bombs were dropped by a few aircraft. It was in 1939 in the Orkney Isles, west north of Scotland. Presumably they were aimed at naval installations. Exactly a month after my father left us to join the army, on the 7th of September 1940, the first Blitz air raid on London was enacted. It happened, it started at 6 p.m. at night, by which time I, as 4-ish, had been put to bed. The siren sounded, Mum came in, grabbed me out of bed, grabbed the Ida down as well, and 348 bombers came over, accompanied by 617 fighters, and did their business. On that one raid, 200 tons of bombs were dropped, high explosive bombs, plus 600 incendiary bombs. Incendiary is intent on starting fires, not so much creating damage. The first air raid lasted for 2 hours. Eventually the all clear was sounded, permitting us to leave the shelter at about 9 o'clock. Back home, put into bed. 10 o'clock, the sirens sounded again. Down to the shelters again. 250 bombers came over. The all clear was eventually sounded at 4:30 a.m. On those 2 air raids, 430 people in the London area were killed, 1,600 wounded. The air raids of that type, Blitz air raids, continued for the next 57 days and nights. 2 to 3 actual raids per night. Overall, in the Blitz period, 28,556 people were killed, 25,578 were wounded in the 71 air raids that actually happened. 18,291 tons of high explosives were dropped. 375 people were created homeless. 2 million homes were destroyed, 60% of the houses in the London area, 1 in 10. That's an example of a bomb-damaged house. Not much chance of going back to live in it again. Next one. In the dense streets of old London, very narrow, big business houses, bombed, set on fire, fire brigade goes into the alleyway with the fire engine, they're playing their hoses on the fire, but with the narrow street, the fire is actually jumping over into the building next door. Also, the burning part is burning up the oxygen available for the firemen to breathe. Many firemen just collapsed. Much of the equipment was damaged, destroyed. Near the end of the war, the fire brigade attended fires in London taxis. They commandeered them, put 3 or 4 firemen inside with hoses, and that's how they attended the fires in the London area. Anybody who's been to London might recognise the Old Bailey. There. And that's how it was during the war, with all the buildings around it damaged. Next one. You go to work in the morning, having suffered an air raid. Hopefully you've got some breakfast inside of you, if you could cook something. You'd walk to work because the buses, the trams, the trains maybe aren't running. over the river bridge from South London into the City of London. Hey, that's where I worked. There's no work there today. It's bombed out. What's that? You turn around, you walk all the way home again and hope you can find yourself another job. That's for people who are employable, who aren't too old, not in services for the Army, Navy, Air Force and what have you. St Paul's Cathedral, complete with skylight, courtesy of Mr Hitler. You don't see that anymore. Next one. St Paul's was taken as a symbol of victory. We can get there, we'll stay with it, we can do it. And Germany made a point of trying to destroy St Paul's Cathedral. How successful? You can see all the vacant blocks around, all the damage. But St Paul's remained. They had a special squad of bomb fighting people, firefighting people, servicing St Paul's. At one stage they carried an unexploded bomb all the way down, outside, and was attended to by the bomb disposal group. But St Paul's remained in one piece. Yeah, I had some more detail, but never mind. Propaganda. We could get propaganda from Germany very simply. Nobody stopped us. If you had a radio, you could turn into Radio Germany, Radio Berlin, and you could hear Lord Haw tell you all about the successes that Germany had had. Germany had sent over 20 bombers, 50 of them returned unharmed, and they destroyed Cardiff, Belfast, London and Glasgow. Our propaganda delivered on newspapers, radio, and posters on the wall said that 600 bombers came over, we destroyed 1,000 of them, and they didn't get round to dropping one bomb. Anything to keep the spirits of the people up. (1941), I was now 5 years of age, and I had to attend school. Sorry, this pulls me back into line. It's dead easy to read, but you've got to keep it in line with the pictures. Aluminium. Houses were, doors were knocked on and Boy Scouts came to the doors. Have you any aluminium saucepans, kettles, anything? Aluminium. They'd take it to a depot and stockpile it, and a truck would come along, load it up. There were our future fighter aircraft in which to combat the German aircraft coming over. Next one. How many bombs were actually dropped on London? Every one of those red balls is a bomb. Many of them are superimposed one on top of the other. Anybody who knows London, Guildford, Reigate, Grays in Essex, Brentwood, Harlow, that's the extent of Greater London. How the hell people still lived in London, I will never know. My mother got me through the Blitz. Many people say, oh, but weren't you evacuated as a child? No, I was not. My mother wanted to keep us together. If one goes, the pair of us will go. One stage she did go down to Southampton and boarded with a family to keep us safe, but we hadn't been down there a week and Southampton got the hammer. So she said, bugger this for a game of teddy bears, we'll go back home and die at home rather than in somebody else's house. Next one. That's the evening views that I, as a kid, often looked at. The fighters fighting the bombers, etc., etc. You'd finish up with a clip round the ear from an adult who'd tell you to get home or get down the shelter. That's the school I was allocated, Bonneville Primary School. Initially, we walked the 2 kilometres, Mum and I, walked the 2 kilometres from home, all the way around the block to this school. Eventually, when I was used to the walk, Mum said, well, you can make the walk yourself, and she got herself a job in London in a cafeteria next door to the American Post Office. This is a modern day picture of my school. There was no such thing as play equipment, but the framework of the building is pretty much the same. Big windows, That was the classroom that I was allocated in my first couple of years at the primary school. Our teacher was Miss, damn it, forgotten her name at all. Bottomley, that was it, Bottomley. How could you forget a name like that? Over time, the bombs were still dropping, and a big house opposite the entrance to our commission area was badly damaged, and many smaller houses around them were totally destroyed. Beauty, it gave us a shortcut to school, and on the way gave us a playground. It was a great place to go to play soldiers and chasing around the damaged, destroyed buildings. But of course adults didn't see the goodness of that. They'd give you a clip round the ear and say, don't go there, unexploded bombs, walls likely to fall down on top of you. But it didn't stop us. One day, the Blitz gradually came to an end as Hitler divided his attention to Russia. His previous ally was now one of his enemies, and the bombing eased off quite a lot. But it wasn't for very long before we as civilians were back in the front line again. On September, and the first, I've lost my place again. All kids, while at school or not, knew the sound of enemy aircraft and friendly aircraft. If we heard enemy aircraft, we knew we had to look for shelter. The bombing gradually eased as they went to Russia, but Germany, ever inventive, launched the first no-pilot rocket bomb, the V1, commonly called the Doodlebug. That was first launched on the 13th of June 1944, a week after the invasion began in Europe. The bomb didn't involve pilots. They were launched from concrete ramps built along the occupied European coast. They had a general direction to fly in. They had no aiming capabilities. They had a 900 kilo nose cone full of amatol explosives. They had the capability of launching 100 of these per day. They didn't have sufficient capacity to go beyond southern England and London. 8,564 of these things were launched. 57% of them got through our fighters and our guns in southeast England. 72 of these particular bombs landed in our postcode area. I was in the classroom along with my fellow students, listening very intently to the teacher when we were aware of an aircraft noise. Wah, 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 wah. We knew straight away, that's a V1. We were under our desk quick smart because the engine stopped. If the engine stopped, it meant it ran out of fuel and it was coming down to explode. So we're under the desks and stayed there. Teacher, meanwhile, stayed standing. Take shelter, take shelter, take... Then suddenly, woof, a big explosion. I can see today, I can still see these big windows coming into our classroom, along with bricks and bits of wood and all sorts of things from the houses on the opposite side of the road. Lots of noise, kids screaming. Eventually it all went quiet. I crawled out from under my desk, covered in dust and so on, very deaf. Lots of the kids nearer the windows were laying on the floor, injured. The teacher was sitting on the floor holding a leg which was bleeding. All she could say to us was, get out. So we did. We made our way down the stairs into the schoolyard. There were no fences around the school anymore. All the fences had been blown away. What do I do? Nobody was there to tell us. All the teachers were busy seeing to the injured people inside the school. What do I do? Oh, I'll do what Mum said to do. When school is finished, and this school was finished, I'll go home, which is what I did. Walked my way home, let myself into the flat with the key, found myself a comic, and sat down and began to read. Mum, meanwhile in London, was serving in the cafeteria when an American soldier came in from the post office next door. I just heard that the London schools had a direct hit. Southwest London. Mum is said to have run from where she worked to the school. On arrival, of course, anybody seen him? No. Has he gone in an ambulance? I don't know. Where's his teacher? I'll ask her. She's gone in an ambulance. She had no idea of what had happened to me. So eventually she made her way home, opened the door, there I am sitting reading a comic. She nearly killed me. There was no more school for a while until it had been done up again. But not to worry, the bombs started to tail off anyway as the Allies advanced through Europe. And then, out of the blue, came the next part of Hitler's weaponry, the world's first intercontinental missile. It could fly at a height of 206 kilometres. It carried 1,000 kilo of ammunition. 3,000 of them were launched, and 1,000 of them hit the London area. The problem, as far as we were concerned, with these secondary rockets, the V2, was they flew so high, nobody could reach them, and you couldn't hear them coming. So you had no chance of taking cover. The engine would conk out as before, and down she'd come to explode. So the first thing you knew about it was the terrific explosion. Germany continued firing at them. 1,000 hit London, and also the invasion beaches of Holland and France. But they gradually decreased as Germany retreated. That's the number of V2s that were hit on London. The others, they don't know what the explosion was, whether it was a bomb or what, because there's no indication with a V2. Next one. Eventually the war ended 8th of May 1945. The experts looked at the mechanism of the V2 rocket, and they said if Germany had employed the V2 rocket a lot earlier in the wars, they would have been ruling the world by now. Nothing could stop them, and they had the technicalities, etc. to do so. Still at school, I got a letter from the King. Just to me, of course. And I've still got it, and I read it through, and I corresponded back to His Majesty and said, I think it's a good idea, send it to all the other kids, and he did. I don't know why people laugh at those things, it's true. Gradually, the war was ended. We got used to seeing Germans and Italian prisoners of war clearing up the streets and the general mess that they'd made. We also found out that Germany had had a severe hammering with our bombing. We had no sympathy whatsoever. They deserved every single bullet, bomb and etc. that they did get. And Japan even more, but we heard less about Japan. You'd hear more about it in Australia than we did. But eventually things started to come back towards normality. Rationing started to ease off. In 1953, lollies came off ration. And as a kid, I distinctly remember going into my first lolly shop and buying off ration lollies. They were made in Holland, they were called Hop Joys, and they were fruit with a soft inner centre. July 1954 saw the end of all rationing. Victory celebrations at the end of the war were held in Pointers Gardens, and you recognise me, of course, because the hairdo. I would ask you, how many children are in that picture? How many male adults can you see? 2. This gentleman here was a near neighbour. He worked in some sort of restricted factory, secretive stuff, something to do with Formica. And this fella here, I got no idea who he was. He just turned up and assisted with the celebrations. Just to double check that you know me, that's me there with the hairdo, and in everybody's way as usual with the sack race. Dad eventually came home. Oh, that's the end of the sweet rationing. Of course, kids weren't that bad. They didn't break into shops and things the way this photo is apparently showing. We used to get most of our lollies from the Americans. You got any gum, chum? And they'd hand over a lolly if you were lucky. Dad eventually came home and resumed his work as a plumber. Some months afterwards, his medals arrived in the post. Mum received them from the postman, opened up the package. Oh, look, Dad's medals. There they are there, I've still got them. And she kept them in the package. Eventually Dad came home from work. She said, look, your medals have come. He closed the packaging up, was halfway out the door again. He was going to post them back. He was extremely bitter, I don't know why. Whether what he'd seen in the war, whether it was the conditions of the occupied territories, or whether it was the separation from his family, I don't know. He never spoke, he never went to memorial services or anything. He was a totally changed person. Is anybody at all from the UK? Which city?
Norwich.
Norwich. I don't think I've got Norwich. No.
Southampton.
Southampton, yes.
We suffered the Blitz as well.
Yeah, oh yes, you did. But the main ones recorded by the government as being Blitz, not just normal bombing. Southampton had 647 tons of high explosive dropped over 4 Blitz type air raids. Anybody else?
Blackburn?
Belfast.
Belfast. Belfast had 440 tons delivered in Blitz conditions over 2 air raids. Now, I gave you those figures as a comparison with London. London received 18,291 tons over 71 air raids. The one that most people have heard about is Coventry. Coventry received 818 tons over 2 Blitz air raids. I'm not disputing any other air raid, they still carried on bombing us with 1s and 2s and whatever was available. Anybody got any questions? No? I didn't send you all to sleep. Before I let you go, I've written my life story on all those events that you saw on the first slide that we put up. The Blitz, the statistics, my life at sea, in the police force in England. If anybody would like to buy one, special today, $15. If you'd like to form a queue alongside Barbara there, she'll see. Laughter again. Thank you very much indeed for being my audience.
Thank you, Cliff. That's been an awesome and awful explanation or example of what happened in that Blitz period. Terrifying. We have a thanker who's about to come forward. David. Oh, here comes David.
Mind you, our experience, both Barbara and I, we had it easy. I only lost one relative in the war. We maintained our home, although we had damage. But we reckon we had it easy during the war, not like some people. They refused to speak about it. Sorry.
Yes, I'm a newcomer to Probus. I've been over 50 years to so many talks as a scientist, and your talk today is the best I've ever heard because it simulates what I involved, a little bit older and younger than you. All these things. I'm at Portsmouth, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
A naval depot.
We don't mind about Southampton being buggered up, but my mother was evacuated, and just to see this, because you were saying the same things, I have a reflection of the first thing I can remember as a child, and my mother evaluated this. Sorry, I've got a bit of a stutter. We evacuated to Guildford, right? My grandmother was there. Now, in England, there's the Giles cartoons. My grandmother was the archetypal grandma. And so we were getting back blackberries or something, and the planes went over. And she got her umbrella and said, "You." Right. About 20 or 30 years later, I said, "What was grandma, you know, she was good. She was telling them tips." She said, "Sorry, they were Spitfires going over." Anyway, I'm emotional over this. It's really good. I saw the same things, but not that you. I think Hull was probably the one that got the most. I think so.
Most
Liverpool.
Bombs.
No.
Oh,
London.
wrong.
London. The
Really?
centre of all commerce, the centre of the Commonwealth, definitely. These figures I quoted are government figures. They were cross-checked with German figures that were available at the end of the war. Definitely in Blitz condition, that's what London had. Just to add a little bit to your talk there about being evacuated, 600,000 children were evacuated out of London. Many of them were told your parents are dead. And that's why they got them away without too much fuss. And many went overseas, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, many of them. And many of them also had experiences of being slave labour virtually. But I know nothing about that because I didn't go.
Did you go back to live in London until an age of what?
Yeah, I left London at about 18
Right.
and went to sea.
Well, did you ever come across the fact in Portsmouth that they found a bomb?
Oh yeah.
And it's 365 kilograms or whatever. Everybody's watching it come out of the ground. If there was a bomb here, they'd evacuate the whole of Melbourne, wouldn't they? Did they do the same thing in England? Did you all watch it come out of the ground?
I point at Barbara. She lived in commission flats the same as I did. She returned to her flat at the end of an air raid. There's an unexploded bomb sticking out of the roadway between the blocks of flats. Within the shake of a lamb's tail, the kids were using it as a slide until the bomb disposal squad came and shushed them off and got rid of the bomb. As a child, you didn't realise how serious it was, and that, I guess with my mother, that's what got me through. I didn't realise the dangers that were in.
Last question, did they give you all a stirrup pump and water?
No. The wardens in the flats had stirrup pumps with water, but they were a waste of flame. They really were.
Well, anyway, look, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
You've been a wonderful speaker for all of us, don't you agree?
Yes.
Thank you.